So my last video slightly blew up, and a few comments on the video made me realize I skipped over a few details, and that led to some confusion. So I'm going to quickly clear those up before continuing with part 2. But first, I'll play the disclaimer I recorded for the first video, but then foolishly didn't include in the final video. Also, disclaimer, I am not from China, have never been to China, and do not speak Mandarin. So if I pronounce something horribly incorrect, I apologize. I removed it because I ended up not using a lot of Chinese words, so the risk of mispronouncing anything seems small. But I now realize it still needed to be included, so folks understood I was coming at this from a Western outsider looking in perspective. I've done my research, but I might still get some things wrong. So if anyone from China or with access to the other side of the Chinese firewall comments with a correction, I will always assume they have better knowledge on the subject than I ever will. So please feel free to correct me when I miss things in the future, because I will miss the obvious again. It'll happen. Anyway, on to my quick corrections. Point 1. Mihoyo has not broken any Chinese law, and they are not at risk of getting in trouble with the Chinese government. They do sneak risky topics into their games, but including those topics in their game is not a crime on its own. None of the rules I listed were laws, except for the miners' curfew law, which they follow. If I believed Mihoyo was at risk of getting in trouble for me pointing out these things in their game, I wouldn't have pointed them out, because I love Mihoyo, honestly. Point number 2. Mihoyo's headquarters is still in China. I don't know why this rumor is such a big thing, but they have not moved to Singapore. They are not outside of China's rules now, and they will never drop the Chinese servers to focus on the rest of the world. Dropping China would be the stupidest thing they could ever do as a company, and they're investing in their own metaverse right now. China is 50% of their total income every year. No other single country comes close to providing that much income to the company. They are never leaving China. It's not happening. The Hoyoverse company was not a complete company rebrand. The Singapore office is just in charge of international business for the company. The translation and dub offices in Japan, South Korea, America, and Canada all communicate with Singapore, and that's about it. The main games are still made in Mihoyo's Shanghai offices. Even if they did move the creation of their games to Singapore, they would still have to be approved by the MPPA to distribute their games in China, like every other game developer ever. Which is point 3. The MPPA, the National Press and Publication Administration, approves every game that can be sold legally in China physically and online. If your game gets rejected, you can make the changes they recommend and submit again, but there is no public list of what will get your game rejected. This is intentional. The list I went through last video was by a gaming expert in China that has seen these things get a person's game rejected before. There were things he was recommending game developers avoid. He was recommending self-regulation so that indie developers could guarantee their games get approved the first time around, instead of paying a lot of money to get approved a second time around. Point number 4. But no official regulation banning these things in video games was ever released, including the effeminate men ban, because it's not needed. If your game has content the MPPA doesn't like, they just don't approve your game. You can't accuse them of making up that rule just to get your game banned, because there's not a set list you can point to. A public ban on things attracts unwanted attention to game regulation and censorship. It pushes Chinese players to just download the international uncensored version. But just because something isn't publicly banned doesn't mean creators don't practice self-censorship or self-regulation and avoid the content to get their games approved. My goal with this first video was never to say Genshin should be banned, only to point out things games creators are recommended to avoid that Mihoyo includes in their games without hesitation, and to point out how silly these regulations were, because one of the most popular games in China already has those things in its game. I know other Chinese mobile gachas break the recommended rules, but Genshin is the biggest Chinese game outside of China, so I focused on it. So why am I explaining all of this? Because it only gets more complicated from here. I used that list because it felt like an easy way to point at risky things Mihoyo was including in their games. Part 2 is more risky things Mihoyo includes in Genshin, but just like the broken rules above, there's no law saying you can't discuss these topics in your game. The only proof I can provide is past times that CCP has censored the topic in media or online. It's not hard. Mihoyo works with an apologize later philosophy. They put interesting topics and almost LGBT material in their games to test where the line is. If they cross that line, they go back and change that one thing. But because of how popular Genshin and Mihoyo are, the censorship board usually lets it all slide, which means Mihoyo has a rare opportunity that they use to its full extent. Because of how censored the Chinese internet is, the accurate learning of other cultures, religions, and beliefs is isolated to those lucky enough to go to college. And even then, most classes focus on cultures within China. Mihoyo is teaching the the basics of Western philosophy, Japanese culture, foreign religions, and so much more to millions of Chinese players that experience extreme nationalism and nothing else in their everyday multimedia experience. They're opening up excuses for these players to discuss these topics without being accused of spreading anti-party sentiment and other things that go against the values of socialism with Chinese characteristics. The common excuse for removing posts on social media and denying foreign films from entering the country. This is an amazing thing Mihoyo is doing that I personally feel is missed by the non-Chinese part of the fandom, which is why I wanted to make these videos pointing out the risks they are taking. There is so much more to this topic, and I highly recommend looking into other sources as well if you're interested in it. As always, I'll link to the main articles in the description if you want to read through the full article. There's a lot I summarized or excluded about Chinese censorship because it didn't have anything to do with Genshin or Mihoyo, like how the sissy men on TV ban was the reason for crackdowns on Danmei media, a crackdown that still hasn't been lifted as of the end of 2023. So I highly recommend researching this more if you're wondering why new C-dramas similar to Untamed and Word of Honor haven't been showing up on Netflix recently. Now on to the main video. But first, spoiler warning. Yes, I did remember this time. Some of the risky topics include Fontaine's Archon Quest, Fontaine's World Quest, and the most recent film event. I tried to leave most of those to the end, but I will also have a little card pop up for topics mentioning a Fontaine quest, so you can just skip individual topics. Like I said, most of the Fontaine ones are at the end. Now then, these are things not outright banned in the game approvement process, but censored on online Chinese social media and television, so it's safe to say it's risky to include them in your game. Even if there is no law saying it's illegal to talk about democracy, I'm using the assumption that if it's censored on social media, it's a taboo topic. I know there are other games, movies, and books available about some of these topics in China, but can you point to another game that includes all of these? Because here's the overall list of risky topics Mihoyo includes. Yes, I am still probably missing some. Discussions of theology, Western philosophy, morality, gray morality, revolution and grassroots resistances, democracy, negative consequences of isolationism, militarism, Japanese culture, smuggling of classified information to the common people, right to information, right to peaceful protest, right of religious gathering of minorities, overthrowing of corrupt leaders, leaders falsifying information, attempts to rewrite history, incompetent leaders, youth and female-run government, natural disasters caused by government negligence, justice, the legal system, the prison system, abuse of power in the prison system, secret police, human experimentation, slavery, human trafficking, poverty, classist exclusionism, LGBT community, mental health, media censorship, and religions not approved by the Communist Party. Now, this is going to get pretty long, so I'm just going to list quests in areas that cover the topics mentioned, so you can go and check out those quests for yourselves. For religion, I would recommend looking up which religion is being used for each nation, and then looking for that specific religion. For example, I have a video pointing out all the Christian references in Fontaine, while others have broken down the Gnostic origins of the Archons' names, the Shintoism that inspired Inazuma's shrines, and the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism. It is important to note that the practicing of religions outside the 5 approved religions is illegal in China. Gnosticism, Shintoism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, and Judaism are not approved religions. Meanwhile, Genshin includes characters following the practices and customs of all these religions, except for Gnosticism, which is instead used as the building blocks of the Tibet world at large. You could even argue Nilu's whole thing is practicing a religion not approved by the state government and doing a peaceful protest involving the performance of religious practices banned by the government. But I'll get into that more in the peaceful protest section. For theology, any of Dane's list quests, but specifically the first one for We Will Be Reunited, where he discusses Venti and the other Archons at the steps of the cathedral. It's also a core feature of Sumeru's Archon quest, as the scholars debate Nahida's purpose and others debate if they should be worshipping Rukkhadevaka or Nahida. But it's not one specific scene. Mordecai's Hangout quest endings also slightly brushes on this. We try to help the Church of Barbados community choir and end up having a really interesting discussion with Venti about his thoughts on the organized religion. Again, the CCP would prefer it if everyone was just atheists, instead of talking about God and man's relation to him. Western philosophy. Western philosophy would be... Alright, pause. I fell down a rabbit hole while researching this section and realized, wow, there's a lot of different philosophy and worldviews here. It's almost like every character has a unique way of viewing the world. No way. So yeah, I'm just going to go over the 3 Greek philosophers I found heavily referenced, and we'll see if the different worldviews of Tibet becomes a video in the future. Anyway, Kaveh is Plato and Al-Haytham is Aristotle, with Al-Haytham also related to the Islamic scholar Hassan ibn al-Haytham that he's named after. This is like the default that everyone knows, so I'm going to give you a bonus one. Scaramucci / the Wanderer is Diogenes, which I know like only 10% of you know who that is. If you ever heard of Behold a Man on the internet, this is him. This is the guy that ran into the Scholars Hall with a plucked chicken and said, "Behold a man." Scaramucci's only reason for sticking around the academia is to shoot holes in other scholars' papers. Also, Diogenes considered himself a citizen of not a city nor a country, but of the whole world, and is thought to be the first to identify as such, which again, Wanderer doesn't consider himself a citizen of one specific nation. Of course, there are plenty of Eastern philosophies in Genshin, but those are not a surprise to see. Confucianism was a core part of ancient Chinese culture. You can't recreate parts of ancient China without references to Confucianism, along with Taoism and Buddhism showing up. But like I said, all of these could be grown into their own video, and aren't a surprise to see in a Chinese video game. So let's move on to morality. Those quests would be Nevelet's character quest, Kave's debate during the Seven Darshans tournament, and everything to do with Wanderer's redemption. Severus's speech in the most recent quest about revenge also fits here. All of them discuss how people have different views of what they consider right or wrong, which leads us to gray morality. Again, Jet's quest, along with Alhaitham during the Sumeru Archon quest. He follows his own code outside of the world preset views of right and wrong. Lenny during Fontaine's Archon quest. Wriothesley's backstory. Daya's character quest. Danesliv's quest again. And okay, we get it. A lot of characters are willing to work in the gray and don't see the law as black and white. Going back to the memo for a second, the regulators would prefer stories that have a clear line of right and wrong, which right now Genshin's main story doesn't have. Instead, it's a debate between the Abyss, the Tsaritsa, and the Heavenly Principles about how humans and beings on Tevet should be treated. No side is labeled as the right side at this point. At first, you'd think it was the Heavenly Principles, and the other two are in the wrong. But the Traveler's whole story arc is about learning the Heavenly Principles might be in the wrong, but I still don't know if we'll be teaming up with the Abyss or the Tsaritsa, because neither of those sides are 100% in the right either. But in order to defeat the Heavenly Principles, Traveler will have to team up with one of them, if not both of them, which would be the ultimate overthrowing of leadership, leading to my next risky topic, revolution. Mondstadt's formation during the Archon War, and Izuma's Archon quest, but specifically the ending with the citizens' protests reaching Raiden in the plains of Athymia. Sumeru's Archon quest, when they overthrew the scholars. Technically, Fontaine's Archon quest, that was actually the most peaceful one, which is surprising for the French Revolution. But Farina steps down after losing the case, while the calamity 500 years ago in Conria happened because they were standing against Celestia and got cursed as punishment. Expanding that to grassroots resistances would be Watasumi Island, Sumeru's Archon quest again, and I'll eat my hat if there isn't a resistance side in Natalan's nation-sized war. They might be getting away with all of these discussions of revolution because none of them happen in Liyue, so there's no implications of standing against the fantasy China's government, but that doesn't change the fact that these are a lot of discussions about revolution, in a time when any talk of Hong Kong's protests gets you instant banned online. Discussing different forms of revolution and different ways to go about revolution just seems risky. And so, democracy. Now, none of the nations have democratically elected officials, but again, Raiden decides to change things because the majority of Inazumans were against the current policies. And it was the people who had to agree Farina was guilty for her to be charged, so the majority voted her out of her seat of power. They just didn't get to vote in the next ruler, as Vice President Nevelet just stepped in instead. Though Fontaine's ripe for an election, seeing as they just finished the French Revolution, and that's when the French formed its first democracy, before Napoleon switch it back to an empire. But we're not here for French history, so let's move on to capitalism. All economic plots in Genshin are pro-independent open trade and supply and demand style economics. Heck, Inazuma is criticized for how its isolationism restricts trade to it from other nations, leading to the implication that trading with other nations is good and restricting to only internal resources is bad, which is a bold take when the CCP is actively trying to pull away from outside influence and trade and wants to go back to China-centric and China-reliant trade in the country. Militarism, again, Inazuma and anything to do with Kujo-Sara. Pro-militarism was on the regulations list as a bad thing, unless it's the CCP's and military. But again, Inazuma is based on Japan, and its military focused on Japanese views on loyalty instead of China's views. Plus, Japanese culture is a risky topic all its own. We don't think about it much here in the West. We see the similarities to JRPGs and don't bat an eye at the samurai and the yokai, but China is super anti-Western and also super anti-Japanese influence right now, with Japan constantly singled out instead of saying an umbrella term for all other East Asian countries. So Mihoyo doubling down on making Inazuma accurate and respectful is nice to see. But that's most of the Inazuma ones, so let's knock out some Sumeru ones. Right to information. Everything in Sumeru about restricting what books a person could have access to. Some forbidden knowledge is just knowledge not given to a person by the academia, aka information not approved by a certain censorship committee. Some illegal books in China aren't officially banned, they just weren't registered through the Publications Committee, aka the MPPA. There have been multiple crackdowns on the distribution of illegal books and DVDs over the years. Dory sells us some of these at the beginning of the Archon quest. Dea also mentions it being illegal for Eremites to own physical books, and the Tanit have a few smuggled books on just basic topics like engineering or plants. China had a huge banned book smuggling system before the internet made that obsolete, but citizens can still get in trouble for being in possession of a banned book. Right to peaceful protest. Nilu's dance in front of the academia is a peaceful protest. Although she rightfully fears aggressive retaliation, nothing is actually done to her. Her peaceful protest is crucial to the actual revolution succeeding, and multiple other characters praise her for publicly standing against the government's restrictions. But what she is protesting can also be seen as restrictions on a person's religious practices. The dance Nilu performs is the same as the one in the Subserus festival. It is a dance credited to the flower goddess and performed in honor of the current Dendro Archon Nahida. Worshipping the flower goddess is definitely a minority culture and religion in Sumeru. The academia labels dance and artistic performances as not important to the development of our nation and bans them. China has been cracking down on religious expression and pushes for its leaders to lead as unyielding Marxist atheists. The fact that this plot point builds to the point of overthrowing corrupt leaders is bonkers to me. How did any of Sumeru's plot get approved? The Akashas are clearly a metaphor for smartphones all linked up to the internet/main computer Irminsul. What people can access from the Akasha is limited based on their social standing and political clearance level determined by the scholar, which is how it is in China. But Traveler questions this method, and the citizens of Sumeru answer that whatever vague answer the Akasha gives is all they need to know, because surely it would tell them more if they needed to know more. Surely they shouldn't question the sanitized information provided by their leaders. It's calling out an internet policy of soft censorship some search engines in China use. Instead of fully banning a term, they instead only provide results from state-owned media outlets, so the party can fully control what information on that topic is available. It's also confirmed in Genshin the scholars can track a person's movements and actions through the Akasha, thanks to Sino during the Archon quest, and that their system can calculate a person's future actions based on that information. That's the goal of China's Skynet, to be able to monitor all citizens and predict future dissidents based on past behavior. Al-Haytham spells out the flaws in such a system. That actions become unpredictable when a person is mixed with others. All of this piles up until Nahida decides to destroy the Akasha altogether, destroy Skynet, because she sees it as a bad thing for society. Sure, she doesn't verbally condemn the Skynet part of the system, but no new monitoring system is put in place afterwards, and Sumeru isn't portrayed as worse off for not having it. Nahida believes everyone should be free to look for their own truths, and not have the censored version handed to them by the system. But the criticism of censorship doesn't stop there. It continues with the criticism of censoring and sanitizing history. Scaramucci tries to wipe himself from the world tree, and while Scaramucci is forgotten, the people that died because of him are still dead. Removing it from the records did not remove the people killed. Scaramucci's quest ends with the Wanderer deciding to relearn the forgotten information, claiming a right to learning that information, even if the actions were bad. Again, China has multiple real-world historical events banned from their social media and deleted from online archives. If you know the 3 T's, you know what I'm talking about, implying no matter how hard you try to hide it or erase it, the history still exists and people have a right to learn from that history is probably one of the boldest swings Mihoyo takes in the entire game. Because of the censorship in China, the CCP must always be portrayed in a positive light. Implying past leaders were corrupt or incompetent is a big no-no. And it's very easy for a fictional corrupt character to be linked to a past or current party leader. Netizens will use any internet slang available to criticize their leaders and government. That's how Pooh Bear got banned from Chinese social media sites. So you can imagine what would happen if Chinese fans started comparing different corrupt actions in Genshin to party leaders. Regardless, Genshin is not afraid to portray corrupt or incompetent leaders, and those leaders getting removed from power. The elders in the Tenryou Commission are an obvious answer, besides the academia. But Yelan ousts a corrupt leader in Liyue in her quest, linking corrupt leadership to not just the foreign Genshin nations, but also the Chinese fantasy nation. And then some of those leaders' incompetent decisions also leads to large-scale natural disasters. The Fontaine Research Institute is floating in the air and killed countless people because of the old guard of researchers. The furnace nearly exploded, which would have contaminated even more of the surrounding land with radiation. Travelers' attempts to fix the furnace were stalled by Tenryou red tape multiple times until we were just told to not wait for approval and just go do what needed to be done. Ignore the officials and just do what needs to be done to save the day. That's not even mentioning Tarasuna Island that's been contaminated ever since Raiden slayed Orobashi and just left its corpse there. Orobashi did nothing wrong, by the way. And then Liyue, in its rush to quarantine the chasm, trapped hundreds of Fatui agents down there to die of starvation, back when they were still allies with Snezhnaya. Heck, the Elazar plague was actively caused by Deseret releasing forbidden knowledge that he was studying into the world. Something breaching containment like, I don't know, a certain virus that may or may not have been studied in a lab before its, public appearance. I hope you guys can figure out what I'm hinting at. But don't worry, there are some leaders Mihoyo portrays in a good light. The young people, specifically women, in positions of power. Jean has been acting Grandmaster for at least 3 years now. Navia is president of her father's company. Yoimiya is basically running the family business at this point. Kokomi successfully started a civil war and led an army against the shogun. Beto is captain of an entire fleet that fears and respects her. Dare runs a whole clan of mercs, while Candace protects the only town on the desert side of the wall. And Zhongli passed leadership of Liyue off to Ningguan and Kiching. Young people replacing the old guard and doing it well, leading activism and change in their respective nations. The CCP doesn't want young people thinking they can change things. They want them to unquestionably support the decisions of the party, which leads us to justice in all of Fontaine. So Fontaine spoilers ahead. Justice is literally Fontaine's thing, but more specifically discussions about justice and what is truly just. And what should we do if the highest authority in the land's definition of justice doesn't line up with our own? Why take away the authority and give it back to the original rulers, of course? Again, implying the way to fix things is to remove the current leaders in power. But does Mihoyo stop there? No, they go on to discuss the legal system and prison system, both of which are hard for me to break down as an outsider. I can't pick out every minor criticism Mihoyo hid in these sections, only the large ones, such as Fontaine's multiple pointless laws that exist just to trick citizens into being charged for a crime. Traveler almost getting arrested because it was the first 3 days of the month, and Paimon was floating. Traveler actually getting charged for unknowingly eating a slice of Farina's cake. And my personal favorite, it's illegal to eat ketchup on its own. It must be a condiment on something else. But again, as an outsider, I can't point out specific Chinese laws that have cost people jail time and are silly. That's an opinion only citizens in China dealing with those laws can explain. I can only theorize its criticism of the credit system, a suggested policy involving a point system where you could have your score penalized for minor things, like smoking in non-smoking areas or jaywalking. The system has failed to be fully implemented in China, but saying some of the infractions seem arbitrary is still something. Again, this could be criticizing more serious Chinese laws, but I wouldn't know. And then the Fortress of Merope's suggestions of prison reform are also impossible for me to properly break down. The guarantee of 1 free meal a day, your own bunk every night, and options to avoid physical labor all day, every day, shouldn't be hot takes. But something tells me them being part of Risley's reform means that's how Mihoyo feels prison life should be, implying it's not how prison life is now. But again, I have no way to confirm this. Outside of China, sources are extremely biased in both directions, but I have no doubt some of the punishments in Dojie's cult are a criticism of current prison punishment tactics, like public shaming events, and how unfinished comedy shows how easy it is for guards to abuse their post to make prisoners' lives worse, because the guards feel like the people in jail deserve it. Bonus thing I found while researching, unfinished comedy is actually a reference to a Chinese film that was originally banned from release in China back in 1957. It was a comedy sketch type film with only 2 main characters, doing a routine back and forth. Some of the bits made fun of new film regulations and the censorship board at the time, and so got banned by that censorship board. Where have I heard that before? Anyway, the film is available as a DVD or rental in modern day. It just never got a theatrical release in the country it was made for. But back on topic, and to their interesting depiction of criminals and the incarcerated. Genshin gives more humanity to its prison NPCs than I've seen in any other game. They all committed some crime to end up in jail, but that doesn't define them. All of them are just people. Some are horrible like Dojie or the 2 Musketeers' father, but most of them are just living their lives trying to finish their sentences. 2 NPCs in Risley's quest want to get married. La Noir's mother was allowed to keep her until her mother's tragic death. Pressing about Caterpillar's crime comes off as intrusive, that it's a personal thing and rude to demand someone to tell you, even if you are a guard in charge. We know none of the crimes most of the NPCs committed. We can guess on a few, but what they really did doesn't matter at the end of the day. It's the person in front of you that matters, though this might just be because of my more Western experience with criminal depictions. China in general seems to have a more sympathetic view of criminals, with the belief that the misguided can be redeemed. So this might not be one of their more progressive takes, and instead just be a cultural norm. But I don't know, it's just a nice change of pace. Meanwhile, Chevreuse is busy running a secret police force of snipers, while the Melazine are investigative agents for Nevelet. I get having police in Justice Town, but 2 other crime suppression departments seems excessive. I like Chevreuse Cheverus and what she has to say in the most recent event, but I do feel a little uncomfortable with how pro-secret police forces this section of the story has become. But then again, Fontaine has some of the worst human rights violations of any nation, so if any nation needed a special task force to deal with extreme crime, it would apparently be Fontaine, cause man does it go through every rights violation in the book. We have human experimentation, the missing girls case. We have child labor with the twins, along with human trafficking of minors, and possibly pedophilia? Not even Sumeru touched slavery, but apparently Risley's parents were 1, grooming minors, but 2, also selling them into a slavery system that apparently exists in Fontaine, which leads me to the large number of orphans in Fontaine and the lack of any proper child services. One of the actors in Farina's Quest grew up in an orphanage, as did the 2 musketeers, but the twins and the phantom thief clearly didn't, and Risley's siblings were all picked up off the streets. The House of the Hearth has apparently become the default orphanage by the time Fremene's mother dies, but that's literally training them up to be Fatui's secret agents. The knave before Arlecchino was extremely abusive to the point where she killed him to take control, and all the kids swore allegiance to her for this act. And when La Noir's mom dies, there's no system in place to return her to the custody of her extended family. Instead, she's just forgotten about in the prison. A guard has to jump through countless hoops to get her back to her grandfather, which all comes together to create the extreme wealth gap between Fontaine's rich and Fontaine's poor. I know it's supposed to reference the aristocrats from before the French Revolution, but man, does it put Farina and Nevelet's running of the country in a horrible light. The poor district, or slums, is in the sewers. Do you know what Fontaine was struggling with? Flooding! Now, I don't need to be a civil engineer to explain the point of below street drains and sewage pipes is to help lessen the flooding of streets. So if at any point the streets have, I don't know, a few feet of water, how bad do you think the lower district is? Spoilers, the tragedy of Passan should have happened multiple times over in the lower district. Like, Nevelet having 3 bad days in a row would be enough to wipe out 80% of those flimsy bridge structures. Poverty and wealth disparity isn't something the CCP likes being pointed out. They don't want the lower class realizing just how bad off they currently are, because then the party's argument of, all we do for the betterment of all citizens' lives is worthless. Look, whether it's Chinese or American companies, I'm all for eating the rich, as the internet saying goes. But again, the CCP doesn't want you pointing out how rich the 1% is currently getting. Unless they decide they don't like you. Then you're committing tax fraud, and they will definitely destroy your entire career in business. But anyway, we only have 3 more points. Oh, good. We're almost done. And the next one is LGBT support, which I briefly touched on in the first video. Again, E has a great series going into this subject, and others have pointed out how Honkai Impact 3rd and Honkai Star Rail also have LGBTs in them. So yeah, Mihoyo is an ally, and I can't wait for them to finally pay off enough lawmakers to allow a gay kiss in Genshin. I'm joking. That will probably never happen. But the next one is a little more serious. It's mental health. The first example would be A, and the depression caused by the death of her sister. The grief and fear causes her to isolate for centuries. Yaimiko's arrival on the plane of Athymia comes off as an intervention, the final plea to pull A back to a point where she's willing to listen and get help. Like, God, A needs some therapy. So many characters do. But hey, at least the next character on our list is getting therapy. Kale has some form of PTSD from her time with Dottore, with lines from her, Tainari, and Sino explaining just how far she has actually come since then. She is also the first playable disabled character in my eyes, with her chronic pain and chronic fatigue. I know an eye patch is a disability, but none of the characters with eye patches treat it like it's a thing that actually affects them. Heck, I can't help but wonder if Cheverus's eye patch is just for functionality instead of because of damage. People shooting at a long distance know to close one eye to avoid aiming down the gun with the wrong eye and missing. Cheverus doesn't need to waste time squinting one eye closed if the eye is already covered. It's just a thought I had. The other option is me making a Christmas story joke about you'll shoot your eye out, kid, but like China really wanted to downplay Christmas this year. So let's just keep that joke between us. Meanwhile, Alhaitham's autistic. If you look at me and say this man doesn't have autism, like, you do know his headphones are noise canceling, right? Like, they aren't hearing aids. And he's the last person you'd picture jamming out to tunes. He also has a social battery, and other characters acknowledge that it's okay for him to step back when that limit is reached. Like, everything in Parade of Paradise points to this, including an ending where he does pull away to a quiet place instead of going to the party. Heck, the end of his character quest is him being accused by another academic for acting above everyone, which is something autistics are accused of all the dang time, simply because they struggle with casual conversation, so tend to avoid conversations that don't directly impact them or their topic of interest. And so they get accused of not caring about a conversation unless it's about them. Al-Haytham has mentally developed to the point of not caring how others see him, which means he doesn't mask or fake a display of expected emotions, making some see him as cold and calculated. Meanwhile, Kave's over here apparently reading the Al-Haytham handbook and knows what he's feeling based on micro expressions. Anyway, Kave has depression and extremely low self-esteem issues. Also possibly alcoholism tendencies, though he seems to be doing better on all of those fronts since moving in with Al-Haytham. Better than Venti at least, who's still a raging alcoholic 3,000 years later. No, we do not have time to unpack all of that, because we also have Layla, and what seems to be narcolepsy mixed with dissociative identity disorder. We only just learned about Layla's system, so we don't know much about them. Just that student Layla seems unaware of cool Layla, and we don't know of any other alters. We don't even know if the alters were formed from trauma or if Layla is just genetically susceptible to extreme dissociation to the point of developing an alter to front for her. But again, this is a fiction with references to Yu-Gi-Oh, so it's either not that deep or extremely deep. Don't worry, we'll come back to this in the Yu-Gi-Oh video. Yes, there will be a Yu-Gi-Oh video. But for now, let's move on to Fontaine, and another character that struggles with disassociation, though he didn't develop alters during those episodes. Fermine describes a place called Penguin Land, and Pears, the toy penguin, is from there. Fermine developed this world while living in the orphanage run by the Knave before Arlecchino. This disassociation, along with what seems to be selective mutism and social anxiety, suggests a similar PTSD situation to Kale. Luckily, Arlecchino's changes and support from the twins has helped Fermine heal and come out of his shell. Now he wants to help other kids. Like he said, help those lost in a dark place. And man, does this event go to dark places. You see, it introduces a fantasy disorder called loneliness syndrome, in which characters build a fantasy reality in their own mind and have delusions. It's not a one-to-one copy of a real-world mental disorder. For what I can tell about the quest, that was intentional. The closest ones are schizophrenia, depression, and maladaptive daydreaming, which isn't a disorder, but a symptom of other issues. MDD is what I believe Fermine dealt with as a child, having a complex dream world with multiple characters and plot lines that one thinks about for hours on end. But Fermine knew it was a daydream, which is why it didn't develop into loneliness syndrome, which, like schizophrenia, causes visual and auditory hallucinations that the patient struggles to separate from reality. That plus depression related to the delusion not actually being reality pushed the first character in the story with this disorder to suicide. There are no cases of maladaptive daydreaming leading to suicide, and it is not an extreme schizophrenics tend to go towards, which is why I believe it's an intentional decision to make it a fantasy disorder. The goal of the event wasn't to talk about one specific illness anyway. It was to talk about the treatment methods of mental illnesses, to try and get rid of some of the stigma around mental treatment. Asia as a whole tries to avoid talking about mental health, which is why, even though mental health isn't a banned topic in China, I still find this to be a very important discussion Mihoyo is having with its players. Because Asia also has one of the highest suicide rates in the world, with most of them being blamed on work-related stress and depression. Of all of the risky topics Mihoyo put in this game, I believe this is the one that affects the most players. Depression and anxiety are high in young people all over the world, but talking to a therapist, psychologist, or psychiatrist can help. And talking to your friends and family can also help. But you can't get that help until you admit to yourself that there is a problem. That's what the event is walking you through. Someone going through the process of accepting they need psychological help, and that it's not a bad thing that they do. It's a good thing. It's a breakthrough when the mom finally agrees to seek treatment for herself. God, so many young adults just wish their parents would get some therapy. And this event was trying to start up that conversation with players. Because if Fermine can work through his social anxiety to make friends, maybe you can too. All of Mihoyo's depictions of mental health have been extremely respectful, and I can't appreciate this game enough for it. As someone who struggles with depression, anxiety, and ADHD, and possibly more, seeing characters sit down and support each other through their mental struggles is a nice change of pace. I wish more media did it. For now, let's finally get to the last point. Oh god, don't look at the time or the 12,000 word word count. Definitely don't look at that, because cutting this video down is the last thing Cheverus would want you to do. Yes, I saved the best for last. Commentary on media censorship and the argument between reality versus fiction. You see, in this most recent event, Traveler helps film a movie, and it's a fun action thriller where two siblings get revenge on the man who murdered their mother so many years ago. But what's this? The book was based on reality, and now the author wants a cop to go through with the revenge murder of the real murderer from the book? What? Well, the cop doesn't execute the murderer before trial, and instead arrests him. Glad we didn't encourage cop violence. Instead, she has to explain why she can't allow a revenge murder to happen in real life. But filming is wrapped, and it has the ending with the two siblings succeeding in their murder attempt. So what should they do now? Change it? Just not release the movie at all? No, Chevreau says that they should leave the film as is, that it was cathartic to read that ending in the book, and that it would feel the same seeing it on screen. That just because something happens in fiction doesn't mean it's the right thing to do in reality, and that the audience is intelligent enough to be able to tell the difference between reality and fiction. This whole YouTube series exists because of Chinese censorship, because it is known they cut the whole endings of movies because they didn't agree with the message. That this sort of censorship should be affecting Genshin, but rarely does. No, instead Genshin sits there and blows a raspberry. How silly would it be to cut the ending of a movie just because it's legally wrong in the real world? Who would ever do such pointless censorship? Surely the audience is intelligent enough to tell reality from fiction. Censoring an artist's vision only makes it a less interesting movie. There's two possible real-world movie censorships they could be referencing with this. Either the recent streaming release of Fight Club in 2022, which cut the entire end of the movie and just had a black screen pop up with this text. Or the older Chinese film A Touch of Sin from 2013, which according to an article in 2017 still hadn't gotten approval to be released in the country, so I'm sure streaming has it somewhere. The movie is actually 4 short stories of 4 different people struggling at the bottom of Chinese society, only to snap under the pressure and commit acts of violence, usually murder. All 4 were based on true stories of crimes committed between 2001 and 2010. I hope you can see the similarities with its plot and the message of the 2 musketeers. But the link doesn't stop there. You see, A Touch of Sin was never approved for release in China, but it was approved for release to the International Cannes Film Festival and won the award for Best Screenplay that year. A movie was pushed by the censors to remove some violence, got released for a film festival, and was met with critical acclaim, but was still deemed inappropriate for Chinese audiences. Like, none of this is a metaphor or allegory anymore. They blatantly have characters saying people should be allowed to see the uncut version, and then have the uncut version be in awards and financial success. The CCP's strict censorship is an intentional display of their complete control over China's information and entertainment. To criticize that control, when that control is what shut the gaming industry down for 11 months in 2021. Like the kahunas on Mihoyo, man. They truly fear nothing, and I cannot wait to see what they include in Natalin. Well, we're finally to the end. If you made it here, wow, good job. I am sorry it was so long. The next video will definitely be shorter. I can totally fit the summarizing of 3 lantern rites in under 40 minutes. Yeah, definitely. But either way, if you'd like to see that video, please consider subscribing and let me know what risky topics I missed in the comments. I did have to skip over a few because of how long this got. Sorry about that. But I hope to see you guys next time. Bye.